Hello, everyone. Welcome to AP Psychology Live on AP Advanced Placement YouTube. I hope you're all having a great day, and I hope you're ready today to talk about classical conditioning. So before we get started with classical conditioning, I do want to give you a little bit of information because some news has been released. So again, this is Miss Benton from Adlai E. Stevenson High School in Lincolnshire, Illinois. But this is a little bit old news, but just to clarify, the exam this year is going to be on Tuesday, May 19th, and all of the exams, no matter where you are in the world taking AP Psychology, it'll be at the same time. So you have to look on the website to find the time for your time zone. So my high school is in the Chicago area. That puts us on Central Time, so my students would be taking this at 1 p.m. Also, the College Board has released relevant FRQ practice right now, and it's available for you on AP Classroom or My AP. So if you want to log on there, you can get some free FRQ practice. You don't have to wait for your teacher to assign it. Your teacher can assign you other FRQs, but you can get started reviewing right now. This is the alternate date, the makeup test date. So that's on June 5th. So I just wanted to point that out to you, but the actual test date is Tuesday, May 19th. Okay, some exam details. This is something we've shown you before, but we have a little bit of more news, right? So we have question 1, that's the concept application question. And typically it has 7 terms. This year it's going to have 8. So you can practice, pacing yourself and practicing with 8 terms. Today, at the end of this session, I'm going to give you a practice FRQ that does have 8 tasks, and that is concept application. The research methods question will have 6 tasks on it. So again, you can practice timing yourself. You'll have the first question, question 1, concept application, and question 2, research methods. All right, so this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to get right into classical conditioning and a little bit of a compare contrast with Operant. And yesterday, Dr. Swope gave you a really great introduction to learning, so that should help you be really prepared for today. And of course, as always, we're going to start with the FRQ that you had from yesterday, Bobby Schmidlap. So he's not a good student. It's not that he's not intelligent. It's not that he's lazy. He just doesn't have the skills that a good student does. Please explain how the following terms might hinder him in his efforts, right? So all of these things have to hinder. That's that application piece. So the first term is insight learning. So insight learning involves like demonstrating a new behavior. That's the learning part, right? And the flash of understanding, that's insight, right? Sometimes in your textbook, it might refer to that flash of understanding as the aha moment, right? So with SOTA, so if you're going to define and then apply, kind of the purpose of that is to make sure that the key pieces of that definition are in your application. So if you're going to just apply, that's fine, but you have to have both the insight, the flash of understanding, and the learning, right? The demonstration of a new behavior in some way. So in this example, what I did is I underlined kind of that key piece, right? What is insight? It's a flash of understanding or aha moment. Then you have to have that in your application. Next term was learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is a far more complex concept, right? So you can see I've underlined quite a bit here. So with learned helplessness, it's this mental state that involves a feeling of a loss of control and reduced effort, like you stop trying, right? Because previous attempts to end something, a punishment, were not effective. And one of the great things about writing a definition first, and then maybe underlining the key pieces, is you can make sure that you get all of those pieces into your application. With learned helplessness, if you leave out like a loss of control, right? Like you can end up with something that just looks like a positive punishment, right? So you have to make sure that you have all the pieces. So here's your example. Learned helplessness is going to occur for Bobby because previous failed experiences in school, there's your application to the specific scenario, have conditioned him, like he learned, that's what condition means, to believe that future effort will just result in poor grades anyway. So he stops trying because he has no control. He feels he has no control over what's happening. The next term is social learning, and social learning is sometimes referred to as observational learning. There's some slight differences, but for our purposes, they are the same. And they are associated, if you remember, with Albert Bandura. And Bandura is a key name for you to know in this class. And he's an individual who is so important, like he's going to appear in more than one unit, right? So you're going to see him here in learning, but he also has a really influential social cognitive personality theory called reciprocal determinism. And if you see a theorist or a name that keeps coming up, in multiple units, you might want to focus not so much on the name, but what that person's research is. So with social learning, you have these two pieces. You have to watch, right? And then you have to imitate. That's how you demonstrate, like you imitate the behavior, right? So you're demonstrating learning. So Bobby watched his older brother and his friends who were not good students, and he imitated their bad study habits, right? And he has not learned how to be a good student, right? So if Bobby just watches and he doesn't imitate, then you're not adding that learning piece and you're going to have an incomplete concept. So you also can't just repeat the word learning. The law of effects, another sort of complex concept. The law of effects suggests that consequences of earlier actions will influence and even dictate future actions. So, that's a very broad definition, right? So with Thorndike and his law of effect, the cats in the puzzle box, voluntary actions that led to good outcomes were more likely to be repeated. Voluntary actions that did not lead to good outcomes were less likely to be repeated. And remember, this is kind of the piece of the puzzle that kind of came before Skinner and operant conditioning. So the consequences of Bobby's previous attempts to study have not gone well. So he's less likely to study in the future because studying didn't work, right? So behaviors that had bad outcomes are not likely to be repeated. So with that, practice FRQ, did you space out your answer? If you did, you would have 4 distinct sections. On your concept application on the AP exam, you're going to have 8 distinct sections. So when you're done, before you upload, you should look down and see 8, right? If you only see 6, then somehow you forgot to answer a couple points. Did you answer the points in order, right? This keeps you from, again, forgetting something. So if you see the 8 terms and you're like, wow, I don't really know one, but I know number 2, just write out the name for number 1, right? Just put down the term, right? Then leave a bunch of space and then answer the one you know and you want to answer first. But keep that order. Did you define, or did you at least include all the aspects of that definition into your application? Apply, are you relating it to the scenario? Okay, regarding the research, in this case, it was about Bobby. Did you double check and make sure that you use synonyms, right? If you had observational learning and your application talked about Bobby observing someone and then learning, you simply just repeated the term, like you're parroting, I guess, and you're not really explaining. And again, I want to emphasize that it's the applications that score, not the definitions. But if you have an application that's missing a key piece of a definition, then you're going to have a problem, right? So make sure that your applications include all of the pieces from the definition. So today we're going to talk about classical conditioning kind of in depth. We've talked about it in the past. We talked about it a little bit, even in the clinical with behavioral treatments. And Dr. Swope talked to you about it a little bit yesterday as well. So first tip, conditioning. Whenever you see that word, conditioning, it just means learning, right? So if you have an unconditioned stimulus, that's an unlearned stimulus. And cognition is thinking. And if you want a definition of conditioning, the best definition that I like is a relatively permanent change in behavior due to experience. So when you add that relatively permanent piece, that means it doesn't include changes like, just being tired or ill, right? And due to experience, excludes changes that might occur as a result of, genetic inheritance, maturation, or maybe an injury. Okay, here's 2 terms that are really, really easy to confuse: habituation and sensory adaptation. So the reason why you might be able to find it easier to separate these terms is there's a reason that habituation is in the learning chapter and sensory adaptation is in the sensory and sensation and perception chapter. So with habituation, the idea is that the brain is hardwired to notice change more than familiarity, right? So repeated, but not necessarily continual stimuli, right? It's going to lead to a decrease in responsiveness. So if someone makes a loud noise, right, you might be startled, right? And the next time they do it, maybe a little bit less so, right? So you're going to have a decrease in that startle response. You can't just say that the animal is getting used to the stimulus, right? You want to have a clear decline in responsiveness, right? So this is learning. So it's a relatively permanent change in behavior. So you want that like response, that behavior. Sensory adaptation, on the other hand, is a reduction in like sensory receptors due to continual exposure, right? So you stop feeling how your socks feel on your feet until just now when I brought it up. But prior to that, your brain is receiving information about the sensation of your socks. It's just not something that your brain is decided to spend time processing, thinking about, right? Now, habituation, you're going to see again this concept in the development unit, because developmental psychologists sometimes use habituation to kind of study babies who are too young to speak, right? So you present them with a new stimulus, something really exciting they've never seen before. They're going to pay attention, right? They're going to look longer. And then if you bring that same stimulus back, maybe 30 seconds or a minute later, they'll look at it again, but for less time, and there'll be a drop off in that responsiveness and their attention, and that's habituation. Another example of sensory adaptation would be the idea that you stop noticing that your phone is in your pocket, right? And you go around looking for it and it's right there, or sunglasses on the top of your head. So remember, habituation is learning, a relatively permanent change in behavior, and sensory adaptation is a perceptual phenomenon. Okay, classical conditioning, sometimes called even Pavlovian conditioning, is a learned association. So a neutral stimulus is paired with an unconditioned stimulus to create, which creates the unlearned response, right? And ultimately, it's going to lead to the creation of a conditioned, right, a learned response. So in classical conditioning, the responses, both the unconditioned and the conditioned, right, they have to be involuntary. So it's an involuntary response or a reflex. With Pavlov, it was salivation, right? Give you other examples. It could be blinking, flinching, sweating, sneezing, shivering, vomiting. And it can also be an emotion, right? So sometimes it's called a conditioned emotional response. So like with Watson, it was fear. So your exam tip here that I want to point out, the reason why I have both of these in blue, is that if classical conditioning works, right? If you have your answers correctly, your unconditioned response and your conditioned response are going to be the same or similar, and they have to be a reflex or an emotion. So if your unconditioned responses, running away or raising your hand, those are voluntary actions. So that would be wrong. Our pioneer for classical conditioning is Ivan Pavlov. And classical conditioning is, again, it's a learned association in which a neutral stimulus, when repeatedly paired with an unconditioned stimulus, creates an unlearned involuntary response. And that in turn, by that pairing, is going to create that learned involuntary response. So Pavlov, basically he started studying the salivation response, right, to meat. But he had a problem, right? So the dogs started to salivate to the meat powder before it was even placed in their mouth. They were salivating to just the sight, right, or the sound of the experimenter potentially entering the room. Dogs were essentially anticipating the arrival of the meat powder. And based on this observation, Pavlov did many studies, right, on classical conditioning. And his work is really important. He was given the Nobel Prize for Physiology in 1904. And there's a lot of practical applications for classical conditioning that we'll talk about today. Okay, so when you have a classical conditioning problem, when you're presented with a scenario and you're trying to figure out what's the US, what's the CS, what's the CR, right, it can be overwhelming. What I like to do is start by the responses, right? So fill in the unconditioned response and the conditioned response. What was the unlearned reflexive action of Pavlov's dog? And you can see it here in the image, right? So it's going to be salivation. So you fill in salivation. The next thing you want to do is, what's the unlearned thing, the US, the unconditioned, unlearned stimulus? What did the dog just naturally salivate to? And that's the meat powder. Then the neutral stimulus, what that's going to be is something that dogs don't naturally salivate to, but because it's paired with that meat powder, the dog will learn, right? So you get a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response. So remember that the two responses are always going to be the same or similar, and they have to be reflexes or an emotion. And then what you do is you kind of back into that, right? So if you have an unconditioned salivation response, what's the natural thing that caused the dog to salivate? Meat or meat powder or food in the image. And then what did he have to learn to? The tone. So Pavlov did find kind of like some kind of general rules, right, for classical conditioning. And the first one is that conditioning is most effective if the neutral stimulus is presented before the unconditioned stimulus. So Pavlov wants to, make the tone, right, and then put the food in the dog's mouth. If you give the dog the food first and then the tone, sometimes the dog's not going to make that connection, right? So if Pavlov rang the bell after he gave the food, right, conditioning didn't work as well. And that's something called backward conditioning, where the unconditioned stimulus is presented before. But ideally, you want to do this the other way, right? You want to do the conditioned stimulus, the tone, before the meat. Conditioning is also most effective if the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are close together in time, right? So if Pavlov, made the tone and then waited 45 minutes to give the dog the food, the dog might not have figured out that association, right? So for Pavlov, you wanted to keep it, he was working with dogs pretty close together. So there are, of course, exceptions to this, right? So another about things being close in time, right? And a big exception might be something like taste aversions. Number 3, also taste aversions. Conditioning is most effective if it's paired many times, right? So Pavlov would ring the bell, give the meat, ring the bell, give the meat. And the dog would make that connection. So soon it would just be the tone, and I shouldn't call it a bell, it was a metronome. Sound the tone, and then the dog would salivate. There are exceptions, again, because classical conditioning of taste aversions, it could just be that one time you had, bad sushi, and even though it wasn't close in time, you ate the sushi and you didn't get sick for hours later, your brain still made that connection. So there are exceptions. And finally, you want your your neutral stimulus, what will become your conditioned stimulus, to stand out from competing stimuli. So like a tuning fork or a metronome is not a typical stimuli in a lab, so it definitely was distinctive, potentially, to the dog. Okay, remember, the two stimuli, the neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus, are going to be the same if learning occurs, so if it works. And those responses, of course, are also going to have to be involuntary, and they're going to have to be the same or similar, right? So in this example, in this image, you're just going to look for the responses, and it doesn't matter if it's unconditioned response or conditioned response, they're going to be involuntary and they're going to be the same or similar. So it's the startled reaction or wincing as your involuntary reaction. And now, what's the unconditioned stimulus? What's the unlearned thing that you naturally are startled by, right? And it's the boom. It's the loud noise of the thunder. And then what's initially neutral, but because it's paired with the thunder, because it's paired with that loud noise, becomes a learned stimulus. And that's just the lightning itself. So this is John Watson, and he's going to take classical conditioning and he's going to use it to create a fear. And Dr. Swope talked to you yesterday about this study, and it's certainly an unethical study. It's not something that would be done today. So if you look at the two responses, they're going to be fear. What's the unconditioned, unlearned thing that the unconditioned stimulus that made the little Albert cry or be afraid? The loud noise, right? What did little Albert have to learn to be afraid of? The white rat. So babies naturally afraid of loud noises, right? So he chose a hammer on a bar, right, to make a loud noise to scare little Albert. So how might classical conditioning explain a fear of dogs? Works in the same way, right? Fear, fear. Unconditioned stimulus was maybe the dog bite or an actual, like maybe a dog kind of coming at you. And then the neutral stimulus is just seeing a dog, right? And you might experience fear. And remember how I said that the two responses are going to be the same or similar? Oftentimes the conditioned response might be not as strong, right? So the fear response to just seeing a dog might not be as extreme as the original fear. That was the unconditioned response. Okay, this term's a little bit harder, higher order conditioning. It's also in some textbooks, it's called second order conditioning. So if you learned that word, it's the same concept. Now, this is a process of taking a second neutral stimulus, a new NS, right, and turning it into a new conditioned stimulus by pairing it not with the unconditioned stimulus, but with the original conditioned stimulus. And this is a case where sometimes the definition, it actually makes it a little bit stranger. But the second conditioned stimulus is going to create a weaker response. So how it would work with Pavlov is he would take the dog, right, and he would train the dog to salivate to the tone, right? And now he's going to pair the tone with a light, like a light flashing on, right? That light is never paired with the meat powder. It was never paired with that, right? So, but eventually what's going to happen is the dog will maybe through higher order learning or higher order conditioning, the dog is going to salivate to the neutral, initially neutral light because it was paired with the tone, right, which is also was a conditioned stimulus, which had previously been paired with the meat powder. So it's just farther down the line. So let's take a look at this and see how this would work in real life. So eventually, the new conditioned stimulus produces a conditioned response, even though it was never paired with that original stimulus. So we're going to start with the responses. So we're going to go with an emotion. So instead of fear, we're going to go with positive feelings, right? So the unconditioned stimulus might be that you went to an exciting Cubs game, right? Or insert your favorite team here, and that gave you positive feelings. So the initially neutral stimulus, which becomes conditioned, is the Chicago Cubs, right? So when you see the Cubs or Cub logo, you feel positive feelings. Now you have a new classmate, a new person moves to your school, and it's just neutral, right? But you find out that new classmate also is a Cubs fan, and you instantly have, more positive feelings for them. Okay, so that's quite a bit. Let's do some practice with classical conditioning. And I want to give you some tips. So if you're looking at something that's classical conditioning, first you want to do is determine that it is classical and not operant, right? It has to be an involuntary response or a, like an emotion, sorry. If it's an example of classical conditioning, you want to indicate all these pieces, right? If it's not an example, right, not classical conditioning, and explain your answer. So this is just a process for us to practice looking at some scenarios that are either classical conditioning or maybe they're not. So here is our first example, Michelle. Michelle accidentally got hairspray in her eyes, which caused her to cringe from the pain. Now, when she's getting a haircut, she cringes when the hairdresser picks up the hairspray. So remember, fill in the responses first, right? What's the involuntary reaction or emotion that you see with Michelle? Then figure out what's the unconditioned stimulus. What's the factor that created that response naturally, right? So you should have 2 cringes, right, for your responses. And then the unconditioned stimulus was literally the hairspray in her eyes, which created a reflexive cringing response. And then what was neutral, just a bottle of hairspray. But because it was paired with that other event, that hairspray bottle now creates that response. Okay, try this one. Remember to start with the responses, then figure out what's the unlearned thing, the unconditioned stimulus that caused that reaction. And then what was originally neutral had no effect, but Lucia learned to respond to in the same way. Okay, how'd you do? Hopefully you had laughs and smiles. And remember I mentioned earlier that the unconditioned response and the conditioned response will be the same or similar, right? So sometimes that conditioned response is maybe not as strong, right? So classical conditioning of taste aversions, right? So the unconditioned response might have just been vomiting, right? And because you had spoiled food, right? So spoiled turkey sandwich. And then when you see turkey or you smell turkey, you might not literally throw up again, but you might just kind of feel nauseous. So you could have them be the same or similar. So she was laughing at the original one. Now the club logo doesn't make her laugh, but maybe it makes her smile. All right, here's number 3. Earlier in the summer, Jean vomited after riding a roller coaster called Daredevil with many loops and steep drops. Later in the summer, when she returns to the amusement park, she finds that when she sees the sign for the Daredevil ride, her stomach feels queasy. So again, fill in the responses. They're going to be involuntary or an emotion, so a reflex or an emotion, and they have to be the same or similar. Then figure out the unlearned thing that caused that, and then the neutral, which became a learned stimulus that caused that same response. Hopefully this worked. And again, notice this happened only one time. So just like kind of taste aversions, which I just mentioned, unlike what Pavlov was doing with the dogs, it doesn't necessarily have to be repeated pairings in order for you to learn. There are exceptions. Okay, example number 4 is about Siggy. Siggy is a very good dog, and he lives in West Bend, Wisconsin. He has learned that when a certain kitchen cabinet opens, he will receive a treat. If he hears that cabinet open, he runs to the kitchen. So think about what this would be. You're going to look for the 2 responses, and you're going to look for the unconditioned stimulus and then the neutral and conditioned stimulus. Okay, so hopefully didn't trick you here, but the response, this response as it's written is not classical conditioning. Now, in reality, it is classical conditioning, because what's probably happening here, you'll see in a moment. Let's try to rewrite this and make it score. So, but as written, right, you have the responses here of Siggy, and what he's doing is he's running, and running is a voluntary action. So if you were writing an example about classical conditioning and you wrote this, it's not going to score. You're going to have to wordsmith it a little. You're going to have to change it to make it actually a description of classical conditioning. So let's try this again. And if you change it a little, right, having a treat. Okay, so Siggy is a very good dog that lives in West Bend, Wisconsin. He has learned that when a certain kitchen cabinet opens, that he will receive a treat. Having a treat makes his heart race and he feels happy, right? So there's your involuntary response. After a while, every time he hears that cabinet open, his heart races and he's happy. Now, in reality, what's going to happen is his heart's racing. That's the involuntary response. And then he's going to run to the kitchen to get the treat. So if you write the response where you're focusing only on that running piece, that kind of is coming after. So now I'm going to have you create your own, because for AP Psychology, you need to be able to create and apply, right? So if you had to create your own example, you're going to choose a subject, a person or an animal. So you could have Siggy the dog, or Nala the cat, or you could have, you know, your brother, doesn't matter. Then pick an involuntary response. And for this first example, I'm just going to give you shivering, right? So now for the unconditioned stimulus, I want you to choose something that would automatically or innately cause shivering, right? You don't have to learn to shiver to that. Then you're going to have to pick something that's neutral, that if you pair it with that unconditioned stimulus that you created, will create a conditioned or learned response of shivering as well. So maybe you would have something like the air conditioner vent in your room is next to your desk, right? And it occasionally blasts a steam of like cold air that makes you shiver. So the unconditioned stimulus would be the blast of cold air, right? But if just before that blast of air happens, it makes a humming sound, right? Now when you hear the humming sound, you shiver. So you would shiver before. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a little bit of side homework in addition to the regular FRQ I'm going to give you later. Again, do the same thing, only this time, choose your own adventure, right? So pick a response, something different than shivering and maybe different than salivating. Try to pick something else and then fill in the other pieces. Okay, so classical conditioning, we have these involuntary responses. And tomorrow we're going to do more of an in-depth dive into operant conditioning. And that involves learning with voluntary responses. But there's these phenomena that kind of work for both. They work with both classical and operant, but we're going to approach it from the perspective of classical today for the most part. In general, classical versus operant, right? You have classical linking stimuli, right? The unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. With operant conditioning, you're linking a behavior to a consequence. So that's where you're going to have those reinforcements and punishments. And that's a voluntary behavior with operant and an involuntary or emotion with classical. And you have these two different goals, right, with involuntary versus voluntary responses. But in both of these, both classical and operant conditioning, you have an acquisition period. So on the left here, you have the acquisition period for Pavlov. So during conditioning is the same as saying acquisition phase. So this is the part of the study, right? This is when learning is occurring, right? Pavlov is repeatedly pairing the tone with the meat powder so that eventually the tone will become conditioned, right? A learned stimulus that would cause a learned conditioned response. And it's these repeated pairings, right? In operant, it's the animal learning that a voluntary action has a consequence, right? And that's going to influence future voluntary behavior. So here's an image of a mouse in a Skinner box, and it looks like he's putting his little mouse paw on the bar. And if he does that voluntary action, and as a result, some food is dispensed and he gets a tasty mouse treat, that's going to influence future behavior because he's going to push the bar again, right? Now, if he pushes the bar and it resulted in like a electric shock or like a tiny bit of pain on his little mouse feet, then he would not repeat that behavior, right? So punishment is going to decrease future behavior. Both classical and operant conditioning can have this period or this phenomenon called extinction, right? And this is a weakening, right? It's not extinct like a dinosaur, like it's just really weakening of a conditioned response because the conditioned stimulus is no longer paired. So if you keep sounding the tone but not presenting the meat, at first the dog's going to salivate to the tone. But if you continue to do this, the salivation response is going to get weaker. It's going to become extinct, right? Because the dog's like, hey, where's the meat powder? Where's the treat? With operant conditioning, you can have a weakening of a learned voluntary response when the consequences are no longer provided. So if the mouse learns to push the lever for the food, and eventually pushing the lever isn't resulting in food, that lever pushing behavior is going to get weaker and weaker, right? And that's extinction. The reason why we say weaker instead of totally extinct like a dinosaur is that we have this other phenomenon called spontaneous recovery. So this is what happens when you have an extinguished conditioned response. Pavlov's dog has stopped salivating to the tone because it hasn't been paired with the meat powder in forever, right? But then sometimes just randomly, if you were to sound the tone, the dog might have a sudden spontaneous, just out of nowhere, without retraining. You're not bringing out the meat powder and repairing, a salivation response to the tone. So let's take a look at this in the context of data analysis, right? So if you were given this graph and you were asked this question, what can you infer about the strength of the conditioned response over time during acquisition phase? So take a minute and look at this graph, right? Look at the what's on the x-axis, right? And what is being measured on the y-axis, the one going kind of up. So you have acquisition phase, you have the neutral stimulus plus the unconditioned stimulus. So for Pavlov, that means repeated pairings of bell, then meat, bell, then meat. And remember, you want that neutral stimulus before the unconditioned stimulus. You don't do meat, bell. So bell, meat. And then that pairing ends, right? You stop pairing that. So you're just showing the conditioned stimulus, just the tone, and extinction, conditioned stimulus alone, is going to occur. And you can see what happens to response. So what's happening here over time, and you can see this in the rise in this curve over here. My cursor will work. Rise in this curve, over time that the conditioned response is getting stronger during the acquisition period. And you can see the strength of the response here on the y-axis. Now, if you're looking at this, compare the condition response during acquisition with the condition response during spontaneous recovery. So again, you're going to look at that X and Y axis and see what's happening here. And you should see that the condition response continues to get stronger and stronger and stronger during acquisition, right? Going up along that y-axis. The condition response of spontaneous recovery is weaker and it drops off faster. So compare the decrease in response strength during the initial extinction period and the extinction period after spontaneous recovery. So we talked about this just a second ago, but you can see that extinction over time, right? It's the drop in response strength after spontaneous recovery is faster than it was after extinction. Okay, next up, we have stimulus generalization, and this occurs again in both classical and operant. So this is a case where organisms learn to involuntarily respond, it's classical, to stimuli that are like the conditioned stimulus. So they're close. So if Pavlov's dog learned to, condition response, learned to salivate to a tuning fork, and then you rang a bell or made some other kind of musical note, and the dog salivated to that as well, that would be stimulus generalization. So with little Albert, he generalized his fear. It was initially a white rat, but soon, little Albert began to demonstrate a fear response to other white furry objects, like a dog. I think there was a fur coat, but he didn't demonstrate fear to totally different objects like toys. Now, with operant conditioning, you can also have stimulus generalization. So if you train the mouse to push a lever when it sees a green light because it gets a treat, and then it puts up a blue light, right? Then the mouse might also generalize its response and respond like by lever pushing to the blue light and the green light, but maybe not to a red light or sound, right? So it's going to generalize to things that are similar. Stimulus discrimination is when the organism learns to involuntarily respond only to the conditioned stimulus in classical, or only the original stimulus in operant conditioning. So for Pavlov, this would mean that the dog learns to salivate only to the bell and not other similar stimuli. So if you train the dog to salivate to a picture of a circle, and the dog was able to learn that a circle and not a square would result in be followed with meat powder, right? It would respond involuntarily to the circle, but not the square. And maybe even it could be more specific, right? So the dog could learn to discriminate between a circle, which would result in potentially being followed by meat powder, but not an oval or an ellipse. With Skinner, again, you're going to have the mouse positively reinforced for pushing a lever when it sees a green light, but it doesn't for any other light, right? So it's going to discriminate. So monkeys, like in the wild, if you want to talk about this in terms of animal research, use discrimination, like in a classical sense, because they learn to fear, right, the sounds of predator birds, right, like eagles, but they don't express a learned fear response to the sounds of harmless birds, right? Monkeys also use discrimination operant learning, right? Because they learn to avoid predators using operant conditioning, right? So if they hear an eagle calling, what they're going to do if they hear that eagle call is they're going to go lower in the tree and look up, which is logical because eagles are going to attack from above. But if they hear a leopard sound, they're going to climb as high up into the tree as they possibly can and try to get out on the littlest branches possible, because although leopards can climb trees, they're heavy and they can't get on those little tiny branches. So in this case, that's voluntary behavior. So animals in the wild use both classical and operant conditioning for survival purposes. Okay, let's check out some examples of applications. So hopefully you recognize this as the acquisition phase in classical conditioning. And this right here is an example of why it might be helpful to do some multiple choice practice. If this was a multiple choice prompt, acquisition was the right answer, but it might have been placed next to things like discrimination or spontaneous recovery. But what it's giving you is an actual example, an actual application. So if you were required to create an acquisition example, you would have some experience with it. Now let's take a look at a graph. After the acquisition phase, Pavlov created vibrations on various other parts of the dog's body, and the dog salivated. So what concept best explains what occurred as demonstrated in the graph to the right? So hopefully you can infer from the image that this is what's happening here is actually stimulus generalization. So the farther away, the closer on the dog's body of the little vibration to the original location of the conditioned stimulus, the stronger the reaction. So the front paw was really kind of far away from the initial spot, and the dog did not react as strongly. Okay, now we have another example. We have a police dog that has been conditioned to respond to verbal commands given by his trainer. The dog, however, learns to react only to the command words if they are provided by his trainer and not other individuals. So what explains what's happening here? And what kind of conditioning is this? Is this classical or operant? So the concept here is stimulus discrimination. The dog is only responding to commands to sit or run, I guess, if they're given by his trainer and not by other individuals. And this is operant because the dog is responding voluntarily. Okay, good job, everyone. Just a quick kind of summary of tips. We have conditioning equals learning. Habituation is learning, but sensory adaptation is perception. So habituation is that decline in responsiveness. It's a relatively permanent change in behavior as a result of experience. In classical conditioning, remember you want your responses to be reflexes or emotions, and they have to be the same or similar. In classical conditioning, your neutral stimulus, your tuning fork, right, and your conditioned stimulus, tuning fork, are going to be the same if learning occurred. And we have these phenomena of acquisition, extinction, generalization, discrimination, and spontaneous recovery that can be used in both classical and operant conditioning. Okay, for the AP practice for tomorrow, I'm going to give you the first 8.1. So this is an 8-point or 8-task rubric, and it is concept, application, and style. So for each of the 8 concepts, I'd like you to apply them to the scenario, and I would suggest a short definition when you write a definition in your own words, like no more than a sentence, just to kind of make sure that you get all those pieces into that application that you create. So for part A, your application is making sure that you apply these in a way that the dog trainer would explain Siggy's behaviors. And for part B, how would a dog trainer explain, oh, okay, so part B, I'm going to have to make a change here. So for part B, I'm going to change this on the fly here. How would a dog trainer explain, who's a Ziggy, explain the owner's behaviors? So thanks for your patience on that little last minute one, because I wanted to have it be a little bit different for part A and part B. So for part A, how would a dog trainer explain Siggy's behavior? Siggy's the dog using these concepts. And part B, how would you explain the owner's behaviors using the following concepts? Okay, let's try it that way. Okay, so now we have a distinct part A and a distinct part B. So for part A, you're explaining Siggy, the dog's behaviors, and for part B, you're going to be explaining the owner's behaviors. So, and with FRQs, like you can ad lib a little, you can kind of add on to the scenario to make it work. All right, thanks for watching, and we will hope to see you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.